Commission on Civil Rights entitled Broken Promises. But before I talk about why we're here, I want to take a minute just to talk about how we got here. So after I first got elected, I visited with President Sharp from the Quinault Indian Nation, and she said, "Have you heard about the Quiet Crisis Report?" And I said, "No." And she filled me in on what was a 2003 report and spoke to the fact that while there were a lot of very meaningful findings in that report, there was not a lot of meaningful action following that report. And she said, "I think it's time for an update to that, and I think it's time that when that update happens, the Congress does something with it." And so I want to thank President Sharp for her leadership in bringing this report back to life. Frankly, we wouldn't be sitting here if not for you and your leadership. Our panelists, starting with President Keel from the National Congress of American Indians and President Francis from the USCCR Sovereignty Protection Fund, we are honored to have you participate in this important conversation. I want to thank my colleague, Representative Cole. I believe Representative Lhamon will be joining us as well. There are co-chairs of the Congressional Native American Caucus, and you both played a critical role in advancing priorities of Native American communities throughout our nation, and I'm very grateful for your leadership and your partnership. I want to thank Assistant Secretary Sweeney from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Rear Admiral Wiaki from the, did I get that right?
Perfect.
All right. I paid attention in approps. From the Indian Health Service, your agencies play a critical role in ensuring the federal government meets its treaty and trust obligations. So I'm glad you're able to join us for this important discussion. And finally, I want to thank Chair Lhamon and Commissioner Narasaki, as well as the staff of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, who helped to create this report. I think they've provided what is of the Commission's mission and highlight some of the key findings and recommendations that are outlined in the Broken Promises report.
Thank you for this very important discussion. I'll just start with a visual. This is the report. Hope you will find it online on the Commission's website. And I want to acknowledge Sarah Lee Sewell, who is in the audience and is the principal author of this report. So thank you for the labor of love. We are so pleased to be part of this critical discussion and to see this crowded standing room only room of interest on this unbelievably important topic. For the 62 years that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has been in existence, we have been charged by Congress to inform Congress, the President, and the American people about the status of civil rights. And in that time, the Commission and our state advisory committees have issued 25 reports about the status of Native American civil rights. So this is a topic that we have turned to many times, and with this 15-year update report, for which we are grateful to have received a request to inform Congress, we are dismayed to report that we have made insufficient progress as a country, and in particular have fallen backwards in some areas, including with respect to housing. So as we look at all of the dimensions of Native American civil rights in this country, this report examines real shortfall in the satisfaction of our treaty obligations. There are 375 treaties between the federal government and Indian tribes that shape and define the government-to-government relationship, and between the United States and the 573 federally recognized tribes across the United States. Notwithstanding those treaties and the reality that Congress has reaffirmed its commitment and its duty to promote tribal self-representation, including as recently as 2016, still today, in the aggregate, Native Americans experience dramatically lower quality of life across every dimension that the Commission evaluated compared with non-Native Americans. Those dimensions include disproportionately high rates of violence and crime victimization, poor physical, mental, and behavioral health conditions, high rates of suicide, low educational achievement and attainment, poor housing conditions, high rates of poverty and unemployment, among other deeply distressing challenges. The Commission majority voted for findings that include that data in general about Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islander racial groups are often incomplete, inaccurate, old, or simply not tracked by the federal government. And even with those limitations, the best available data suggests sometimes extreme social and economic disparities between these communities and the national average. Our federal programs that are designed to support the social and economic well-being of Native Americans remain chronically underfunded and sometimes inefficiently structured, which leaves many basic needs in the Native American community unmet and contributes to the inequities observed in Native American communities. The federal government has also failed to keep accurate, consistent, and comprehensive records of federal spending on Native American programs, making monitoring of federal spending to meet its trust responsibility difficult. So the Commission majority voted on some key recommendations that include that the U.S. should live up to its treaty obligations, just as the U.S. expects other nations to live up to theirs. Congress should pass a spending package to fully address the unmet needs, targeting the most critical needs for immediate investment. And the spending package should specifically address funding necessary for build-out of unmet essential utilities and core infrastructure needs, such as electricity, water, telecommunications, and roads in Indian country. I will stop there and turn to my fellow Commissioner, Commissioner Narasaki, to give some depth to that summary, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Congressman Kilmer, for your deep commitment to addressing Native American concerns and your support of the Commission. Thank you also for working with President Fawn Sharp and the Quinault Nation in your district to arrange a listening session for us, which provided extremely valuable information, and I hope that you see the results reflected in our report. I'm also pleased to see Representative Cole and hopefully Representative Holland joining us today. I feel that this report comes at a very auspicious moment with the historic election of 2 Native American women members to Congress. The first item I proposed as a new commissioner in 2014 was an update of the report after hearing from the National Congress of American Indians and tribal leaders about how extremely important and useful the Commission's 2003 Quiet Crisis Report had been in their work and the need for it to be updated. After receiving the Congressional request, we worked to expand the report to include the economic development issues and move beyond the purely budgetary discussion that had been in the original report. We also worked to integrate Native American issues into all of our reports at the Commission, including the most recent on police use of force and on voting rights. I want to highlight 2 of the recommendations that we made in Broken Promises that I hope we'll hear about more in this discussion today. First, our investigation showed that the right kinds of investments do make a difference. At our South Dakota State Advisory Committee hearing last year, Native American entrepreneurs presented many promising initiatives that were bearing fruit once they were able to get programs to work as they're supposed to. However, the lack of core infrastructure is extremely limiting to the economic well-being of those who make their homes on reservations. Our report therefore urges Congress to make a major investment in unmet essential utilities and core infrastructure projects in Native American communities because this basic infrastructure is critical to being able to meaningfully improve the health, education, and economic conditions on tribal lands. Second, we recommend that the federal government provide steady, equitable, and non-discretionary funding directly to tribal nations to support the public safety, healthcare, education, housing, and economic development of the tribes and their people. We made this recommendation after finding funding for Native American programs often comes with unnecessary restrictions that hamper their access to funds. For example, in most instances, Native American programs receive funding that is subject to sequestration, which has had devastating impacts on Native American programs and is inappropriate given our treaty obligations. We also found that Congress often provides funding for programs in a manner that makes the long-term planning and budgetary difficult for tribal governments and undermines their recognition of Native Hawaiians. This is very significant because it reverses the erroneous position the Commission had taken over a decade ago. If our recommendations are fully implemented, we believe it would signify a new era of renewed commitment to our nation's trust responsibilities, and we look forward to discussing them further today. Thank you.
But I wanted to maybe kick things off by focusing on two of the Commission's recommendations to Congress, which are first, pass a spending package dedicated to addressing the unmet utility and infrastructure needs in Indian country, and second, providing steady, equitable, and non-discretionary funding directly to tribal nations to support Native American programs. I'd love to just invite panelists to weigh in on how we can begin to make progress on what I think is a very important but undoubtedly difficult goal. And maybe President Keel or President Sharp or President Francis, and then I'll invite others to weigh in too. You just have to hit the button.
Go ahead, Fawn. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think both those recommendations are consistent with not only what tribal leaders have identified, but across Indian country with the Interior Trust Reform Commission, we heard that all across Indian country that many of the failings in the trust responsibility all come down to a lack of funding. Whether you're talking about healthcare, education, law enforcement. And so when tribal leaders tried to address trust reform as an overarching agenda, it came down to a lack of funding. And I think we learned through the sequestration process when Interior folks were reaching out to tribal leaders suggesting, we need to hear your stories. That made it very clear to us that there was a disconnect between BIA officials and what was actually happening on the ground to Indian country and what those impacts meant. And I just cited an example at Quinault when there was an across-the-board proposed cut in our forestry program. It appeared to be a basic $150,000 cut, but that meant a wildlife biologist and a pre-sale forester had to be laid off. And we fell 2.5 years behind our annual allowable cut, and that meant $12 million lost revenue opportunities to the nation. So there has to be a line drawn between looking comprehensively on the ground, and I'm so happy with the leadership of Congressman Kilmer and the commission who came out to do a field study to meet with tribes in the Northwest to understand those connections. But having a comprehensive funding package to close the gap, as well as making sure that any cuts to Indian country are not in that discretionary pot of money, because these are treaty commitments and obligations, that would be a good first start, and I think a necessary foundational piece for us to maintain our services. Beyond that, some of the recommendations that we would offer, in addition to those two, I think there needs to be a comprehensive look at tribal economies. We are trying to build profits through corporations to close the gap, whether it's gaming or cannabis or some of the other for-profit enterprises that tribes are now examining. But ultimately, as tribal nations, we are sovereign governments with taxing authority, with the ability to raise revenues within our borders, and there's a finite economic pie within our areas. But at this moment, we are paying taxes to state and local governments. I own a house on fee land within the reservation. Excuse me, as president, I write a check to the Grace Harbor County Tax Department. They do not provide services. There are B&O taxes. There's a whole host of taxes that are collected by other authorities for economic activity within our borders. There are utility taxes. And so if we could take a hard look at solidifying and shoring up and strengthening the inherent sovereign authorities of tribal nations to raise revenues through a system of taxation and other governmental powers that every government sovereign economic reforms, when you look at a comprehensive tribal economy, oftentimes we are focused on tribally owned businesses, but a healthy economy is so much more than that. That is one spoke. We should look at attracting companies to locate and site within Indian country. And I've had bilateral, multilateral discussions with diplomats from other countries who are interested in siting renewable energy projects, other things within Indian country, and I think we could offer some incentives to do that. There's also building a private sector economy. How can we help our individual citizens The private sector economy in the United States is a huge economic driver. We started the TOLA Fund at Quinault, which is a community development financial institution, and we've grown from 5 to 32 small businesses. And so how can we build that private sector economy? So I think tribal nations have a very clear vision of how to close that gap. There's an incredible gap between our current economic conditions and the vision that we have for a prosperous future. And Congress can do its best to try to close that gap, but where it falls short, Congress needs to partner with tribal nations to strengthen our sovereign and governmental powers around taxation and around building an economy beyond our governmental powers to attract the best companies, to help build our individual tribal businesses on a micro-sovereignty level with regard to individual citizens. And I think all of those would be worth a hard look at, a strategic look at, and a close working relationship with tribal nations to really understand our vision for how we believe we can close the political, economic, and social shortcomings and crisis within our borders. Thank you.
Thank you, and wholeheartedly agree with everything that's been said. One of the things when we talk about infrastructure and building, meeting the needs of Indian country, anything that has to do with infrastructure, the tribal nations need to be included in those packages, in those discussions. Tribal leaders need to be at the table, involved. Continue our development as tribal nations is a lack of broadband support. Broadband is critical for even education, not just for economic development opportunities, although that's one part of it, but everything from healthcare, education, all of those things that allow when a child goes to school, they get a tablet, some sort of iPad or some electronic device that allows them, the tribal nations, more flexibility and access to that is one way. The other is transportation needs, roads and transportation, particularly those in travel to get back and forth. And it impacts everything from housing to education again. So many things that across Indian country, the needs are there that have been ignored for years, for centuries. When we talk about broken promises and we talk about treaties, anytime the word treaty is used, that's a contract between the United States of America and a tribal nation that was involved in that treaty. It's a promise. It's a contract. And if you break that contract, then, there is no honor there. So the United States of America expects different countries around the world to honor their treaties. We should do the same with the tribal nations that they've entered into those contracts with. So there's so many things that we can talk about in terms of level of need funding for programs that do have those treaty and trust responsibilities attached to those. There's so many things that we can do, but it has to be a bipartisan effort in Congress to work together with tribal nations to improve those aspects. Thank you.
Did you want to weigh in?
Good morning, afternoon now, I guess, everyone. It's an honor to be here on behalf of the United South and Eastern Tribes. Congressman Kilmer and Congressman Cole, as always, thank you for your ongoing support of Indian country and for having this hearing today. I will try not to be redundant, but it's impossible when you have this many presidents at one table, I guess. But I will say that this is a extremely important discussion, and it should be a discussion framed in changing the dynamic based on the evidence of this report and of everything we know that exists on the ground as tribal leaders. When we talk about infrastructure and funding and treaty obligations, we hear a lot about unmet needs and need-based assessment figure that gets thrown around that's invested in any country every year. Much of that, of course, is forced into a competition process of the tribes in these grants, and they're extremely competitive. They come with a lot of strings, and they don't really recognize the diversity of needs within each sovereign government to be able to address on the ground real problems. So we have to about meeting treaty obligations and letting tribal leaders and tribal communities assess the needs from there. And that way, we can address these crises in a way that recognizes the diverse tribal governments that are out there and the diverse needs, whether it's geographical or whatever it is. And as an example of that, we're all facing substance abuse and drug crises in our communities, I think, and around these opioid things. Well, 10 years ago, there was entirely, and rightfully so, but almost entirely the focus was methamphetamines back then. In the Northeast, we were already dealing with the opioid crisis. We could not obtain the resources to adequately address that back then. And so, and we'll talk about some of the stuff between mandatory and discretionary and advanced funding as we get to the healthcare discussion, I'm sure, so I won't go on and on. But I think, to me, it's an opportunity to foundationally start thinking about how we're interacting and focusing on what this is. It's a nation-to-nation relationship with an obligation based on a long history. The condition today is not the fault of any one individual sitting here. This has spanned multiple administrations, multiple Congresses, and multiple tribal leaderships, and we have to find solutions, and we have the great tools here and evidence to
both weigh in on this subject, and also I invite you, if you have questions for any of the panelists, I want to defer to you now.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you again for convening the hearing and having the discussion. The problems, the complexity, the history behind it is the lack of understanding in Congress and in the federal government in general for what sovereignty is, what obligations it places on times, but violent enforcement capability that to me would be have a goal. What do we do to strengthen the ability of every single tribe, no matter what their circumstances are, to control, insofar as they can, their own destiny in the same way that other governments and other sovereign entities do. The second thing is the delivery of services. And here, and I want to thank my good friend Representative Kilmer, because he's had a lot to do with this, but literally we are way behind in Indian health. But the reality is, over the last decade, if you actually look at appropriations, there's been pretty steady progress under both Democratic and Republican regimes in Congress, because the Interior Subcommittee on Appropriations has decided it's going to try and be serious about fulfilling its trust obligations. Now, it's got a couple of big problems. I would argue on the Indian health front, we really need to get the mandatory funding the same way that every other American that gets health care from the federal government has mandatory funding. Big believer in that. If you can't do that, you at least ought to have advanced appropriations, so no tribe is subject to the impact of sequester or the unable to plan because literally we don't get our job done in Congress. Again, that doesn't happen to other health care providers. We protect them. We protected Medicare and Medicaid from sequester. We did not protect the Indian Health Service from sequester. When we don't get our budget done on time, it doesn't affect the delivery of Medicare and Medicaid services to the average American. It does affect the delivery of health care to the average Native American. So, that's something that we've struggled with for a long time. Betty McCollum has a wonderful bill with Don Young to at least forward fund. Let's take care of something that should be relatively easy. Although I have to tell you, I find the budgeteers, whether they're Republican or Democrat, both resistant to this idea. And so they're effectively sanctioning a situation where where Native Americans live under one healthcare system, particularly if you're on a reservation, and every other American has something very, very different and available to them. So, dealing with the practical problems, Congress taking the small steps that it can while it works on the larger issues is a big part of this. I will tell you again, there has been progress over the last decade on both the sovereignty front and, frankly, at least in scattered areas. But it really depends on who happens to have a gavel at a particular time in a particular place, as opposed to having a consistent approach in this. And to be fair, again, to Congress, the reality is the level of knowledge about tribal sovereignty and Indian varies dramatically from district to district, just based on what's the presence of tribal nations inside a particular district or inside a particular state. pretty hard for some of my friends in the Southeast, which was basically, a lot of tribes were eliminated or moved out to my part of the world in Indian Territory. They don't have much historical memory of that happening. They haven't been taught very much about it, and so they don't know much about it. But again, recently, and we've had, I would argue the courts don't know a lot about it. I mean, you can't look at the Carcieri decision and think the United States Supreme Court had a very clear idea of what tribal sovereignty was, and they interpreted the law in very narrow ways to effectively create two different kinds of Indian tribes. That a Secretary of the Interior could put land into trust for one group, but couldn't put it in for all the others. So I think a lot of this is looking at discrete problems and trying to get fixes in the short term while you work on much bigger problems long term. I will say this: it helps when we have more Native American activity in Congress. I will tell you, having been here long enough to live through the Abrahoff disaster and then see tribal nations, number one, defend themselves politically. Because there was an effort to really limit their political participation a number of years ago. They stopped that, and now I see much more tribal presence in Washington, D.C. than I've seen before. I want to give I guess we have our own little Chickasaw reservation right here, since we're seated together. But I want to give my friend, Lieutenant, I always think it was Lieutenant Governor, but obviously President Keel, and the National Congress of the American Indian a lot of credit, because they've been fighting this fight for literally decades. But we are better off than we were, and I think we're at a period where we could make a lot of progress in the next few years.
I'd love to invite Admiral Wiaki to weigh in, since Mr. Cole mentioned the healthcare. Obviously one of the key findings of the report is there still seem to be very significant gaps in health outcomes. Maybe you could talk a bit about how you see efforts to improve that situation, what sort of challenges you see, and what Congress can do to help.
Thank you, Congressman Kilmer and Congressman Cole, for the opportunity for the Indian Health Service to provide an update on the progress that we've made and the challenges that continue to exist in providing high-quality health care for American Indians and Alaska Natives across our country. Since the 2003 Quiet Crisis Report was issued, the Indian Health Service, in partnership with federally recognized tribes throughout the country, have made some major advances in upgrading the infrastructure across Indian country. One example of that, through federal appropriations, we've enhanced access to care by constructing 4 new hospitals, 16 new health centers, 2 new youth regional treatment centers, and a large number of staff quarters that help enable us to recruit healthcare professionals in hard-to-fill positions throughout the country. The IHS and tribes have also partnered on 20 joint venture projects, and a significant number of those were completed in the 2004 to 2019 time period. And we've leveraged resources and other funding to construct 24 small ambulatory facilities by tribes throughout the country. And although these accomplishments are impressive, over the past 15 years, the congressionally mandated 2016 Facility Needs Assessment Report has identified a healthcare facility need of $14.5 billion that continues to exist throughout Indian country today. The community infrastructure has also benefited since 2003 with the provision of new and improved water and sanitation facilities for nearly 350,000 American Indian and Alaska Native homes. Like healthcare facility needs, the sanitation deficiency system has data showing an infrastructure need across all of Indian country totaling $2.7 billion. So there continue to be significant needs in that arena as well. Some of these significant infrastructure improvements are directly linked to the $500 million that was provided to the Indian Health Service from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And then for the past 2 fiscal years, in 2018 and 2019, Congress has provided the agency with $350 million to increase infrastructure needs. So the Indian Health Service does have a significant listing of identified critically needed projects that are all ready to fund, or shovel-ready, as we like to refer to them as, and appreciate Congress's support and the partnership of our tribes in realizing those needs being met.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on the healthcare challenge?
Can I throw in something? This is a pretty modest suggestion, but it's one within Congress's bill. You know, I will just tell you, having served as chairman, now ranking member of the Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education Subcommittee on Appropriations, and having sat with my good friend Mr. Kilmer for quite a number of years when I was on the Interior Subcommittee, part of our problem here is a pretty simple one of how much money does each of these committees have at its disposal. You know, for those of you that don't know, and Derek certainly will know this very well, we fund the government through 12 bills, and most of Indian funding is discretionary funding, not mandatory funding. He's sitting over there in Interior with a total budget of $31 billion. Indian Health Service is actually the largest single item in that budget, and one that has been very bipartisan and incrementally increased now every year for a decade. It's been a long time since we've had that kind of run of increases. But there's still a limit. He's got $31 billion. He's got the national park system. He's got the BLM. He's got a limit. Why Indian Health is not over, frankly, with the Labor, Health, and Human Services Commission, because that's where, you know, physically Indian Health is located. That committee has $180 billion at its discretion to deal with these problems. And so it's very difficult in Interior to sit down and think, okay, how could I get $3 billion over a number of years to incrementally do it? It's a lot easier if you just put it where the money's at to lay out a long-term problem. And it's a lot easier. You know, right now we have literally a very small part of Health and Human Services goes to my friend's subcommittee to testify and to talk about what their needs are, and he's got a very limited. You move that over to a different, literally just a different subcommittee, all of a sudden there's a lot more money available, and you literally can make a lot more progress on what would become a much smaller part of a much bigger pot, and that actually just makes it easier to do.
Yeah, please.
I'd like to address the healthcare issue. It also seems like not only is access to care a challenge, but quality of care. I've often asked tribal leaders within your reservation, do you have a tribal code that sets out if you're going to practice medicine within this reservation, these are the standards of care, and these are this is how you're going to practice medicine. In other systems, there are standards of care, and there are oversight commissions, and there are ways of regulating quality of care as well as access. We have basic funding to fund doctors, pharmacists, dentists, but we do not have a comprehensive healthcare delivery system that includes all those other component pieces. And so, as an example, I have a classmate of mine. She went to the clinic a couple of times, was sent home with basic instructions. Her condition worsened. She was then transported to Olympia, which is 2 hours away, and she had double pneumonia. At 46 years old, she passed away. And so, you know, there are stories like that all across Indian country. So acquiring a system, a comprehensive system that not only really places an emphasis on access to care, but quality of care, and being able to have physicians be able to make timely assessments on basic ailments is a challenge, and is proven to be fatal throughout Indian country. So I think that's an issue. Another thing I'd like to add to this conversation is I think there's a great deal of opportunity within looking at traditional medicines. When I've talked with tribal leaders about success in alcohol and drug treatment, there are traditional components to that, traditional foods, traditional diets, traditional medicines, and how our elders have treated our citizens historically. I think there's incredible value in bringing that to a conversation where we can define a comprehensive healthcare delivery system.
I want to invite if President Sharp or President Francis or President Keel, if you have questions either for the commission or for any of the panelists, I'd love to invite you to ask one. Otherwise, I'm happy to. I got all sorts of questions. So, no, okay. I want to, since in President Sharp's initial statement, she talked about economic development and the importance of promoting economic opportunity. I think that's a key component of self-determination, a key component of self-governance. And let me invite Assistant Secretary Sweeney to weigh in here. You have thoughts on some near-term policy solutions to help foster tribal economic opportunities, tribal economic development. I know Congress passed the opportunity zones as part of the tax bill. Curious if you see that as a valuable resource, and maybe talk a little bit about that subject. I want to welcome Chairwoman Holland. Thank you. I know you were chairing another committee, so this is another example of our need for clones. But let me invite Assistant Secretary Sweeney to weigh in, and then perhaps I'll defer to my colleague, Representative Holland, after that.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to participate today. It's always good to come together in a very bipartisan manner to have constructive discussion, and I appreciate the opportunity. With respect to economic development, I've been in my position for about 10 months now, and started at the end of July last year. And as I walked into the halls of Interior and met with our team, it was the message that I wanted to deliver was, let's go beyond economic development and focus on economic growth in Indian country. You talk about opportunity zones and what Congress can do when opportunity zones were identified. One of the first things that I did was have a map created that identified Indian country and overlaid other areas of Indian country that are not included in, whether it's access to capital, improved energy transmission, lower energy rates, access to Indian country through the road system, and the ability for e-commerce through broadband. We also need to include other parts of Indian country, and opportunity zones certainly provide that mechanism for Indian country that are located in those zones. Congress can help us out in expanding opportunity zones to include all of Indian country.
Any other thoughts in terms of other things we should be looking at on the economic development front?
Well, again, it was mentioned earlier, the need for broadband.
Yeah.
And one of the initiatives that we engaged in as I started was, again, I'm a visual person. I want to understand issues, and when we were talking about broadband and this map of Indian country, overlaying where the energy transmission lines are in this country, and there are areas in Indian country that don't have energy transmission. And when we're talking about growth or development or advancement of our people, how can we expect our children to do their homework in this century if they cannot go home to plug in a laptop, to recharge an iPad, or to turn the lights on, let alone have access to running water? And so I welcome the opportunity to work with members of Congress and associations like NCAI to look at those types of infrastructure needs that help in the growth and the development of Indian country economies.
I want to recognize and defer to my colleague who was chairing a committee, but she's not been here a long time, but she's already made a huge impact. And Congresswoman Holland, I'd love to just invite you to say a few words, and certainly invite you if you have questions for any of the panelists as well, to whether it be the commission or others, to weigh in.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you for convening this. It's so important. And absolutely things we need to be talking about. And I I share the concern about broadband internet service. Yesterday, I had the good fortune to speak with Dr. Aurora. He started this ECHO program and has found ways to essentially help people find not only the health care they need, but he's extended this program to crime and to education and to all of these areas through its mentorship, its technology, it's combining all of these things together so that people who live miles and miles and miles from the nearest clinic have a way to be treated. If there's no specialist on site, they can be treated in a community health setting, and it was extremely interesting. But of course, the main issue for me when I think about Indian country in New Mexico is broadband. And when I spoke, President Keel, at the State of Indian Nations, my congressional response, I talked about digital reservations, and I mean, if we had broadband to connect all of us to the outside world, it would change lives in our country. And that is something that absolutely needs to be done, because economic development depends on it. In places that have 40 to 45 to 50% unemployment, Native Americans, they don't sit around and wait for the jobs to come to them. They start making things. They start making jewelry and traditional items, and they start finding a way to make sure that they have the money to support their families. And I just feel like with all that entrepreneurship across our country, in Indian country, having broadband internet service would expand their reach to consumers worldwide. And so, and I think the economy absolutely goes hand in hand with healthcare, right? If we're healthy, we can work. If we're healthy, our kids can go to school. It's an all-encompassing situation that I think myself and my colleagues can help immensely. So I look forward to that. I look forward to having those opportunities, and I'm so honored to be here with all of you. Thank you for coming, and I'm going to listen for a few minutes, and if I want to jump in, I will. But real quick, I'll tell you what my subcommittee hearing was about today. We want to protect Chaco Canyon. That's my ancestral homeland in New Mexico. We want to preserve it for generations to come. And so we had tribal leaders from New Mexico. They came to speak with us about that, and we also are working to make sure that the tribes at the bottom of the Grand Canyon don't get uranium in their water. And so to me, those are really simple things that we should care about. And so I'm really anxious to hear more of this conversation. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think at the root of a lot of these problems, I mean, both economic development and infrastructure really is location, location, location. If you happen to be lucky where you're located, if you're a gaming tribe next to a great gaming market, that's great. If you're in an isolated place, you can build the best facility in the world, and it's not going to work as well as somebody's got, we're very fortunate. We have I-35 running from one end of our territory to the other, with Oklahoma City at one end and Dallas-Fort Worth at the other. So it's a pretty good place to build gaming facilities. And the great tragedy of Oklahoma history, of course, was the opening of reservations to white settlement in some ways, but that also meant that we ended up with a lot more infrastructure because it was put there for the white population, not the native population. We could still put land into trust within our historic reservation, but that doesn't happen if you're Pine Ridge or you're Rosebud. There's no state obligation to be there. So I think one of the things the federal government has to do is decide what is the basic level of infrastructure. And to me, it would include things like roads and broadband, that literally everybody's entitled to and every tribal nation's entitled to under trust responsibility. That becomes something you do. Some places you won't have to do very much. Again, if you're located in a great metropolitan area or in the vicinity of one in California, you probably got all the basic raw infrastructure that you need. That, again, is not true if you're in more isolated parts of the country in the Southwest or the upper Midwest. And to me, that becomes a federal obligation, because believe me, you can literally go up to a lot of these reservations and see the infrastructure stop on the edge of the reservation, because a lot of it's been state developed. They don't feel any obligation to continue their road network through the reservation. They sort of foist that off on the federal government. Federal government hasn't done it, hasn't ever said what a basic standard is. And so you get these really dramatic disparities, and that hinders everything else in terms of economic opportunity, including, we can talk about the best healthcare system in the world, and I will admit I'm prejudiced. I think every tribe ought to run their own, but that's up to them whether they want to contract or not with the Indian Health Service. We do it that way, and I can tell you it's been dramatically better since we began doing it that way. I remember once Governor Anatobi telling me that when we started doing this in the 1970s, a lot of our own people questioned whether or not we could do it. And they said the first thing they noticed is all the wait times went down. Because you might not be able to call somebody at the Indian Health Service, but you could sure get a hold of a tribal legislator pretty fast and start chewing on that person, and all of a sudden the service got a lot better. So empowering the tribes, but providing a basic agreed upon structure and saying if these basic things aren't there, then we haven't met our trust responsibility to the federal government. If these roads aren't there, this broadband service isn't there, those are things we have an obligation to provide.
I want to try to hit on a couple other issues before we hit our witching hour. Although, did you have something you want to chime in with? Please go ahead.
I'm happy to, I don't know where you're going next. I
That's
might
all
be
right.
wasting your time. But I just want to touch on a couple of things just real quickly that we've touched on. I think advanced appropriations and mandatory funding for the Indian Health Service is critical to tribes moving forward. We're talking about things that are beyond physical health. This is about community wellness. As we sit here today, under the funding mechanism we have in place today, there are tribes all across the country setting priorities for what kind of health care that they can address for the remainder of the fiscal year. What that leads to is a lot of on-the-ground issues like prolonged pain management, leading to a lot of the addiction-based issues that we're facing in the community. So there's a trickle-down effect from the inability to strategize from how we're going to attack community health when every year with a 25 to 30% diabetes rate in the community, we're fighting to get special diabetes reauthorized. And I know we're preaching to the choir in here, but I think that the ability to plan and move forward on things is going to be critically important to overcoming some social and obviously we all know the health disparity issues tribal communities are facing. On the economic development front, the opportunity zones, I would encourage Congress to look at designating tribal communities as opportunity zones by the mere fact of being historically underutilized business areas, as the congressman said. Geographically, we're already challenged. One of the things that would be extremely helpful is some parity in the tax code for tribal nations that were entirely left out of this recent reform. And things like tribal and state dual taxation really stymie investment and do not give the tribes the ability to put in a unique structure that, again, is in line with what states and local governments can do to create advantages in their communities to overcome some of those challenges for business development. So I'll just end with that, Congressman, and thank you.
Thanks. Go ahead.
In addition to sort of the opening remarks I made with regard to economic development and building a comprehensive economy within our borders, one of the specifics I'd like to just touch on briefly is international trade. In 2008, we considered a carbon sequestration proposal coming out of 7 states, tribes in a 7-state region. At the time, the domestic market was trading at $2 to $3 a metric ton through voluntary systems in the Chicago Climate Exchange, an exchange in New England, one in California. The international market was trading at $32 a metric ton. But domestic companies couldn't access those markets because the U.S. was not a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. And I raise that as an issue to make the point that I think there are international markets that tribal nations could engage in to attract foreign investment that otherwise would never see the shores of the United States. And so there's a whole world economy out there that other countries are curious about tribal nations, are interested in doing business with tribal nations. And one of the specifics beyond renewable energies and climate policy is tourism. There's a great deal of interest, and I think that's an industry, a service industry. It's one of the largest imports, and there's, again, a great deal of interest. I know at one point Interior did a partnership with the White House. I think it would be helpful to have tribal leaders participate in trade missions. We have a lot of goods and services that, when combined, our collective buying power and spending power is tremendous, and there is a great deal of interest in the international community and throughout the world in doing business with Indian country. They find that working with our teams, there's business certainty. I found that with some of the engagement that we've had with other countries that have been wanting to site projects at Quinault. We're working on an oceanic fiber project on the West Coast, which I'm confident will open up a whole host of opportunities for tribes, not only on the West Coast, but throughout the western states. So those are just some ideas. I think that there's, again, going beyond reservation boundaries to national and international. There's just a tremendous economic force, and tribes have tremendous standing to keep and protect what is traditionally ours and to showcase that to the world, because the world is definitely interested in doing business with us.
Excuse me.
Yeah, please.
I just want to add one thing. We'll go back to something that Admiral Wigaki had mentioned earlier about health care. It does relate to economic development. In Indian country, today there's this thought, I think is kind of universal, that all tribes are gaming tribes, and that's not necessarily true. There are tribes, the gaming industry, tribes that do have casinos and other economic development interests. They use those funds to reignite growth within their own communities. They reinvest that in their own people. And so they meet the shortfall of the federal government's responsibility. And that's what they utilize those funds for. The Indian Health Service is funded right now about 53% of the actual need, which means that we get about half of what we really need in order to meet just the basic healthcare delivery within Indian country. I think the need right now is probably around $35 billion, something like that, $36 billion that's needed. And we're asking for, I think this year, maybe $7 billion. So we're not even close. We're not even in the same ballpark. So tribes that do have economic development activities going on are using those funds to meet that shortfall, to make sure that their tribal citizens do raise the level and quality of health care within their areas. So Congress can help in this area. When we talk about infrastructure, we talk about the BIA loan guarantee program, which is basically unfunded. We talk about the CDFI programs within Indian country that allows tribes and tribal nations to go back and reinvest and assist other tribal nations in their development activities. That's what it's all about. And so Congress can do those things. So what the question is, what can Congress do? Fully fund those programs, whether it be healthcare, housing, transportation, whatever it is, fully fund those at a level that takes into effect or to account their true responsibility to Indian country.
I think that's a very important message. I want to ask just a quick final question, and then I'll invite if folks have any closing comments. I promised we'd get you out of here by 2 o'clock. But to the commission, one of the greatest honors I've had in this job was getting to interact with Billy Frank Jr., who was an iconic leader. He used to say, "Tell your story, tell your story, tell your story." And I know you came to Tahola and visited the Quinault Indian Nation. The former chair, Marty Castro, came, and Commissioner Narasaki, you came, and I'm very grateful for that. And you heard a lot of stories there. I thought maybe just in the time we have, if you can just talk about if there was any specific story that stood out that led to it being incorporated into this report. I'm thinking, for example, the fact that this report highlights the heartbreaking issues around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, or anything else that you heard as you went out and heard stories around the country.
Sure, I'll start, and I'll invite Commissioner Narasaki to share. The reality is that the stories are devastating, and there's not one story that stands out there. There are so many, but the gestalt for me is the trust that so many tribal members had in us, in sharing those stories, and in doing the respect that this report would do to share that information and bring it to Congress. It is so exciting to me for the commission to be able to form the basis for this kind of rich discussion and for us to be able to lift up that information. Some of the more devastating moments for me include Commissioner Narasaki and I both went to a State Advisory Committee briefing in South Dakota. And we went there on different days. And in the day that I was there, we had a tribal leader who looked at me, pointed to me, and said, "What are you going to do to make sure that our children are safe and to make sure that these conditions don't persist?" And it's a little painful for me to be able to say what I'm going to do is write a report. So, but I am very grateful to be able to carry that memory and honor it with this conversation and to be able to move forward to concrete remedies so that 15 years from now, we are not saying that we have regressed and only made marginal progress, but that we actually are in a place to live up to those tribal responsibilities.
Thank you for that question. I first want to note that this is my last year on the commission. My term ends. And I hope that one of the things that Congress and the tribes will think about is two of us, our presidential appointees, we're terming off, two are congressional appointees. No one on the commission right now comes from a Native American background, and I hope that one of the things that you will be asking the president to consider is making sure that one of his appointments does come with that kind of experience and knowledge, because that voice is so critical. And there are two things I remember. One, for the Quinault Nation, was the notion that the reservation was, maybe, 3 hours from Microsoft, and yet there's no broadband. And the kids who have to take the annual test, high school test, have to be bused somewhere 3 hours from Microsoft. And we all know how important broadband is. It came up a number of times. It's so critical. It's the minimal infrastructure. And when we came up with that recommendation about a basic big investment in utilities and roads and broadband, I was thinking about the Marshall Plan and how we understood as a nation that if we helped other nations invest, they could become trade partners. They would help our own economy. And I think about that for Indian country. If we invest in Indian country, they will become greater economic engines that will help the states around them as well as our country. So I hope that Congress will think about it as an investment as opposed to some kind of handout, because I think that's critical. The other was in South Dakota, the missing women and children. We had an open public comment period with people who were testifying about the loved ones that they were missing. And the lack of infrastructure, the two issues, the lack of infrastructure for criminal justice systems in the tribes, because we don't invest in them to be able to have jails and courts and everything that they need, as well as the need to work out the jurisdictional questions to make sure that someone has the responsibility for investigating and holding people accountable to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I hope that one of the things I've actually reached out to some law schools and said to them that I think one project that would be fabulous is to come up with some model programs like I think Minnesota is exploring, where they're trying to work out shared jurisdictions to solve that issue so that we do not have missing American women and kids in this country.
I both want to respect all of our panelists and the promise I gave them to wrap up by 2 o'clock, but I also want to respect our panelists in case they have anything they want to say in closing. So I would invite if anyone has anything brief that they want to say in closing, just out of respect to others. I don't want to deny you that opportunity, particularly to my colleagues, if you have anything that we didn't cover that you want to say in closing.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah. Well, just one thing quickly, and it's probably a sort of bleak one. You know, when I talk to tribes, I always, the most transformational thing for my tribe and the tribes that I represent has been the development of independent economies really since the 1980s. That's probably the most transformational thing, honestly, in the state's economy, is what's happened in Indian country in Oklahoma. And so at the end of the day, yeah, you ought to fight for everything you can get because the federal government is way short of having met the obligations it's made. And that's one battle. But the other battle is at the same time to get as economically self-sufficient as you can because as Lieutenant Governor Keel suggested, you know, being successful in business, nobody will invest in us like we've invested in ourselves. And the difference in our healthcare system is really much more dependent on the money, the value added, the extra money that's come in, and that's true across the board. So the things Congress can do, the first thing it can do to me to provide every tribe at least with some sort of level playing field, and will never be the same every place because, again, the tribes are so different. The economic opportunities where they happen to be situated vary very dramatically. But at the end of the day, if you don't have basic roads and you don't have basic infrastructure, you don't have the things that governments are supposed to provide, then you're never going to have the ability to be prosperous. So to me, starting on this infrastructure piece and then starting honestly on the self-governance issues, you've got to give the tribes the power that they need to actually address their own problems. You know, violence against women was a little bit of power to address a really severe problem of sexual assault and abuse in Indian country, largely honestly by non-natives. And so if you don't give people the ability to govern themselves and to run their own economies, then you're really condemning them to a really bad situation in most parts of the country. So we have to look seriously at this sovereignty, jurisdictional, self-governance piece, as well as just the tangible physical things that the government is obligated to provide tribal nations.
Chair Holland.
There, a fight with the
I
microphone.
swear at it. It helps.
Thank you. I'll do that internally. Thank you, members of the commission. Your work has already helped, I think, many of us to know and understand what needs to be done. It's not just writing a report. It's a report that you put your blood, sweat, and tears into, and I recognize that and appreciate it very much. And in fact, I would just like to say that for the first time in history, me and my colleagues are the tribally enrolled colleagues of mine in this body. We introduced the Not Invisible Act of 2019 that essentially is a step toward finding I hate to say solutions, but because I don't know that yet, but forming an advisory committee to move forward with finding ways to combat violent crime in Indian country. So thank you for your inspiration. And I feel like I need to put a challenge forward for my colleagues, Mr. Cole, Mr. Mullen, any of us who have tribes in our districts, to put forth a letter to say that we do want a Native American on this commission, because our voice is extremely important in this time. And so perhaps we can, commit to doing that together.
I saw my staff nodding vigorously when it was raised, so, yeah. Thank you. Any other closing thoughts?
I just also appreciate the commission's work. As a tribal leader now in my 5th term, going on 14 years, I guess, these issues on the ground are extremely critical to the success of our communities and fixing them moving forward. And I would just add, I found this one statistic extremely, surprising a little bit, but, the natural resources in profits made off federal lands are over $20 trillion. And the budgets we're talking about at a fully funded basis is 1% of 1/10 of that. So this is not anything from a funding standpoint that I don't believe is so significant that we can't overcome it. And I know that there are challenges in governing and appropriating and all of that, but I just wanted to briefly say here that I look forward to that new conversation about a new approach on the trust relationship and trust reform and setting up a model that's truly reflective of where we need to be in this relationship. And to all the members in here, your work has been invaluable in our communities, and I appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, real quick. I just want to thank everyone on this panel, thank our congressional partners, the leaders of the commission, my fellow tribal leaders. It's always an honor. In my opening remarks, I said there's a symptom to a much deeper problem. These are all symptoms, and the deeper problem is the chronic underfunding. The second piece to that that I cannot let this hearing go without speaking to is the issue of political equality. And I want to thank Congressman for raising the question of sovereignty and jurisdiction, because right now, tribal nations are politically marginalized. We consult in over policy, legal objections. We still witness unilateral action affecting our land, territories, and resources. This month, our state's attorney general announced consent as a policy. The Quinault Nation intends to advance consent as an agenda not only throughout the Northwest, but across the country, because until we can achieve true independence in our decision-making, free from external interference or unilateral action by anyone, whether it's a state, local government, or federal agencies, or multinational corporations, we're going to continue to be marginalized and oppressed politically, economically, and socially. So I welcome any engagement with Congress on how can we continue to advance and redefine the relationship between tribal nations and the United States, because it's long overdue. Hands up. Appreciate all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. With that, seeing no one else clamoring for the microphone, I think it's important to point out this is not the end of the conversation. This is the beginning of the conversation. And our hope is to continue to build progress on not just what we heard today, but what is in this very important report. I also just want to take a moment to thank each of the panelists for adding their voice to this. I know some of you came from very far away. My colleagues, I know there are a multitude of demands on your time, and the fact that you were willing to take an hour out to talk about something I think is just fundamental. Thank you for that. I want to thank everyone in the audience as well, and for folks who joined us remotely. Technology is amazing if you have access to it, but we clearly have a lot of work to do, and I'm encouraged by the collaboration shown by all the folks on this panel, and I want to thank everybody. I, for one, and I know my colleagues are eager to get to work. All right, thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you.